For nearly 50 years, Madame Chiang Kai-Shek was one of the most powerful women in the world. She was neither president nor ruler of China, but for a woman of her time, she played an extraordinary role in world affairs. Married to an ineffective leader and blundering general, her relentless diplomacy guided China through war, famine, and the threat of bloody revolution.
We shall fight. We are not defeated.
Yet her ambition and hunger for power was nearly her downfall. An affair with a man who could have been American president nearly destroyed her marriage and her influence in China. But in the end, she triumphed over every adversity to place China at the heart of world affairs at a time when it would have otherwise been on its knees. For a time, she held the fate of millions in her hands. She was the greatest leader China never had.
For that which is morally wrong can never be politically right.
China in 1943. Embroiled in World War II and in deep crisis. The country was struggling to resist the invading forces of Japan in a war that was to see 20 million casualties and create 95 million refugees. China was on the brink of collapse. Madame Chiang, the wife of China's leader, now set out on an emergency mission to America to beg for billions of dollars of war aid. As a woman and a Chinese national, she was about to make history and address both houses of Congress directly.
It's a proud day for the United States of America.
On this one performance was to rest the fate of hundreds of millions of her people.
Let us not forget that during the first 4.5 years of total aggression, China has borne Japan's sadistic fury unaided and alone.
The story of how this extraordinary woman came to hold a position of such rare influence had begun nearly half a century earlier on the other side of the world. By the time of her birth in March 1897, the country of Madame Chiang Kai-shek's childhood has seen 2,000 years of ruling emperors. This was a traditional and conservative China. Named Mei-ling, meaning beautiful mood, she was born into one of the wealthiest families of the era. But Mei-ling's family wasn't typical of their time. Her family was politically influential with strong links to Western culture. Yet despite her position of privilege, as a female in the 1890s, the young Mei-ling was in many ways a second-class citizen, especially when it came to education. Boys from wealthy families were educated, but there were no schools for girls older than 15. If Mei-ling's family wanted more for her, they would have to take an extraordinary step and send her abroad for her education. In 1907, aged just 10, little Mei-ling arrived in America. The country Mei-ling's parents chose for her education couldn't have been in more stark contrast to Imperial China. Mei-ling was about to spend her impressionable formative years thoroughly immersed in Western culture. She first attended a school for young ladies in Georgia. Then, age 16, she transferred to the prestigious Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Her unlikely southern drawl, picked up in Georgia, amused her teachers. She thrived at Wellesley, immersing herself in the Arts and Music Society and taking full advantage of every aspect of a well-rounded Western education. In her senior year, she was awarded the highest academic distinction and was named a Durant Scholar. By the time she graduated age 20, a confident, feisty Mei-ling had a degree in English literature, a flawless accent, and so little Chinese that for a time she had to have a language tutor. Mei-ling told an American friend from Wellesley,
"The only thing Oriental about me is my face."
But all along, her love for her homeland had remained strong. Mei-ling's homecoming in 1917 was to the cosmopolitan city of Shanghai.
I climb in dear old Shanghai, then I'm dancing, sweetheart, with you.
She initially slipped back into the cushioned, leisurely lifestyle of her privileged upbringing, but quickly grew bored.
In my arms, dear, away from home, dear, we'll let the rest...
Mei-ling complained in letters to a close friend from Wellesley that as a socialite, her education and intellect was being wasted.
You cannot believe this of the little vehement Spitfire, can you? I just feel my mental powers getting more and more dulled every day.
So, in a manner quite unbecoming of a Shanghai lady, but precisely in keeping with the actions of the Wellesley Spitfire, Mei-ling threw herself into local politics. She began to investigate working conditions in Shanghai. For a woman of her privileged upbringing, what she witnessed horrified her. For everyone but the very wealthy, China was falling apart. The people were in a dire state of deprivation. Hunger and poverty was widespread.
The sanitation was appalling. So much misery everywhere. Sometimes when I look at the dirty, ragged, suffering humanity in our slums, I feel the sense of utter futility for a great and new China.
She was beginning to think and talk like a politician. But Mei-ling was known for more than just her work in the slums. Her confident and flamboyant style was getting her noticed in wider circles. So it was hardly surprising that, aged 26, she caught the wandering eye of one of Chinese politics' rising stars. Chiang Kai-Shek was an army officer whose dream was to bring democracy to China. Politically progressive and personally ambitious, he was also fast gaining power and influence. The fall of the monarchy in 1912 had left a political vacuum in China, which did nothing to ease the country's poverty or stem the widespread civil unrest. The emerging Nationalist Party, led by Sun Yat-sen, sought to unite China. But when in 1925 Sun Yat-sen died, there was a tussle for power within the party. If Chiang played his cards right, the position of new leader could pass directly to him. Mei-ling's eldest sister, Qing-ling, had been married to Sun Yat-sen, the man whose boots Chiang wanted to fill. So the political benefits of a potential union with Mei-ling were obvious. According to Mei-ling, she and Chiang met for the first time in 1923. It was no coincidence. Her middle sister Ailing had purposely arranged their meeting. Mei-ling would later describe how she was attracted to Chiang's shining eyes, but he was also now a potentially powerful man. But this was more than simply a relationship of political convenience. The couple fell deeply in love, so much so that neither of them seemed to mind that he already had a wife and a son. Within weeks, Chiang would flatly deny knowledge of his wife. He sent her away to America. Directly she set sail, he wrote to Mei-ling,
I am no longer interested in political activities, but thinking about the people I admire in my life. You, my lady, are the only one.
Later that year, Chiang and Mei-ling discussed their future together.
We love each other. I think this is the happiest day of my life.
Soon after, Chiang proposed. They were married on the 1st of December, 1927. The wedding was the highlight of the political calendar, and the happy couple made sure the great and the good were present to witness the union. By now, Chiang was a major political figure, so foreign diplomats and even the commander-in-chief of the American Pacific Fleet attended. The guest list ran to over 1,000. This high-profile couple were firmly on the political map. Just 2 days after their marriage, Mei-ling's new husband was named supreme head of China's military forces, effectively assuming the role of president.
May I introduce to the audience the President of the National Government of the Republic of China. Long live the Three People's Principle. Long live the revolutionary spirit of the Nationalist China.
In the first week of 1928, Chiang traveled to China's new capital, Nanking, to try to unite his troubled country once and for all, under his nationalist flag. Traditionally, the new Madame Chiang would have been expected to be submissive to her husband and to fall back into the restricted life of a married woman. But this was not her style. She wrote once again to her friend from Wellesley.
He wants me to be identified as his wife, but I say nothing. And I am going to stand for something myself. I want to be recognized because I'm I, and not because I happen to be his wife.
So Madame Chiang did the unthinkable. She defied convention and followed her husband the 170 miles to Nanking, the seat of China's government. She was the only official wife there. It was a taste of things to come. Madame Chiang was set to become a political wife, the likes of which had never been seen before. But the China her husband now ruled was in political meltdown, on the brink of civil war. Chiang's Nationalist Party hadn't been the only political force to emerge in the post-imperial era. Mao Zedong's rival Communist Party, with its army of peasants and workers, backed by the might of Soviet Russia, was using the civil unrest to fuel the pathway to revolution. To make matters worse, in 1931, the old enemy Japan invaded and took control of the entire northern province of Manchuria, installing their own puppet government there. Throughout China, there was outrage. But Chiang did nothing. He firmly believed he would not be in a position to fight the Japanese until he had first united his own countrymen. Chiang never doubted he was the right man to unite China, but he couldn't do it alone. Until now, Madame Chiang had played the role of supportive wife, present but not politically active. That was about to change. When foreign embassies moved en masse to Nanking, Chiang was at a loss. He spoke no English and had little knowledge of Western culture. Madame Chiang stepped in. She became her husband's secretary and interpreter. Wherever Chiang went, Madame Chiang went too. At the same time, their personal relationship blossomed. Chiang wrote in his diaries,
"My wife is very happy to see that I put national affairs before everything else. I know that she is always thinking of me. I believe that she understands me."
The feeling was mutual. Chiang was protective of his new young wife and looked out for her. At the time, Madame Chiang wrote,
Chiang takes care of me. Sometimes I get so overworked I cannot think. Then my husband says, "Now you go over to the south bank to the country and stay there a few days." He just picks me up and sends me off.
By now, Madame Chiang had reason to feel overworked. In 1934, she had been given her first official government position, Secretary General of the Chinese Air Force, responsible for modernizing China's inadequate air defenses. General and Madame Chiang were beginning to develop a formidable partnership, but it wasn't long before Chiang was to run into trouble. Factions of Chiang's Nationalist Party considered him to be a dictator.
Marshal Chiang Kai-Shek, aided by his attractive wife,
Angry and frustrated at his lack of impact against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, dissenting generals took Chiang captive.
But Kai-Shek, Premier and Commander-in-Chief of the army, fell into the hands of the rebels, and for some time anxiety was felt for his safety. The rebels
Madame Chiang stepped in. She held a series of stormy meetings with the rebels holding her husband. Within 2 weeks, Chiang was released. Madame Chiang's reputation as a political heavyweight was sealed just as her husband's was beginning to crumble. But Chiang's weakness had not gone unnoticed abroad. On the 7th of July, 1937, the Japanese launched a full-scale invasion of a weakened and chaotic China. The aim was to conquer the entire country. China was completely unprepared. Within just 5 months, Japanese forces pushed ever deeper into northern China, and from there advanced to the capital, Nanking. In just one encounter in Nanking, over 300,000 Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers were massacred.
No defense that China can devise can withstand this relentless advance. Triumph is to the invader.
The brutality, rape, murder, arson and looting shocked the world. Millions were made homeless. Hungry orphans roamed the streets.
Who could wish starvation for these little ones? The governments of the civilized world condemn war, but there can never be any stronger condemnation than this.
Chiang was in a real crisis. His exhausted troops lacked advanced military technology. China's forces simply couldn't cope on their own. Chiang saw only one possible solution: to concede territory to Japan and buy time. Time in which China could beg for American arms with which to fight the Japanese. It was a high-risk strategy. But Chiang had a formidable weapon. In his wife, he had a master of diplomacy with important American connections. She was his and China's only hope. Madame Chiang immersed herself in her new high-profile role. In the spring of 1937, as unofficial ambassador, Madame Chiang gave an impassioned speech to the American press.
I am speaking to you just as the echoes of exploding bombs have died down. Death comes from the clear blue sky, just as it has come to thousands of our innocent people throughout the length of our land. You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly. No nation could carry on such wanton destruction and yet retain the respect of the world.
Madame Chiang hit the American press circuit hard. Between 1937 and 1938, the American press published more than 100 speeches, press statements, and interviews of hers. She was reported to be regularly working through the night, generating a momentum in China's favor. She also never passed up a photo opportunity, sewing soldiers' uniforms, visiting orphanages and the wounded. And she'd do anything to make sure her work was noticed overseas. She wanted America to recognize China as a nation under siege and deserving of help on a grand scale. Yet despite Madame Chiang's high-profile work, very little American aid was forthcoming. Then a most shocking chain of events would begin to turn the tide in her favor. By 1939, Europe too was at war, in a brutal fight with the Nazis, allies of Japan. America was appalled by the aggression, but untouched by the direct actions of either the Germans or the Japanese, she was reluctant to become involved. Madame Chiang was undeterred. She appealed directly to America's rulers.
Either congressmen should stop expressing horror at aggression, or they should stop encouraging aggression by permitting gasoline, oil, and other war materials to be sent to Japan.
In 1940, President Roosevelt did freeze Japanese assets and put an embargo on exports to Japan. He also sent 100 American pilots to serve as mercenaries in China. Madame Chiang's desperate pleas had made an impact. But Roosevelt's was a small contribution to a huge problem. It would take something of much greater significance to fire up America. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Within just 24 hours, America had declared war on Japan. Now Britain, America, and China had a common enemy. Madame Chiang was at the heart of this powerful relationship. It gave her the opportunity to exert even more pressure and influence, and perhaps this time gain significant war aid for China before it was too late. But behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to appear. The war with Japan highlighted the fast deteriorating state of Chiang's army and the appalling conditions of his soldiers. Corruption was rife. Disease spread through the ranks. Typhus and smallpox took the lives of thousands of his men. Morale was at an all-time low. War had been a disaster for China and a disaster for Chiang. The Allies began to view him as the incompetent general behind a badly run and bankrupt army. The Americans in particular were all too aware of his faults. It was down to Madame Chiang to soothe the uneasy relationship between America and her floundering husband. But there were personal shortcomings to deal with too, because a rift was beginning to develop in the Chiang's marriage. Beneath the surface, the seemingly unbreakable partnership of love and loyalty was crumbling. Madame Chiang told a confidant that her marriage to Chiang was now one of convenience. At the same time, rumors spread of Chiang's impotence. Others said his indulgence in Shanghai brothels as a young soldier, where he repeatedly caught venereal diseases, was said to have rendered him infertile. Madame Chiang began to realize the man she was fighting so hard to protect had numerous failings. Her desire to loyally serve her husband faded. She would still put China before all else, but she was now also in search of personal glory. And if her husband didn't admire her physically, then others certainly did. In 1940, Republican politician Wendell Willkie lost the presidential election. Willkie planned to run again in 1944, and in the interim spent his time crisscrossing the globe, meeting heads of state. Described by one of Madame Chiang's friends as a great hulk of a man, Willkie had been invited to China's wartime capital of Chongqing. It was an opportunity to impress a man who may one day be President of the United States. It was 1942, and Madame Chiang had been married for 15 years. Willkie had asked his journalist friend, Gardner Cowles, to cover his visit to China. Cowles' diary recalls how during an evening reception, Willkie's temporary absence was noted, as was Madame Chiang's. Willkie returned to his apartment at 4 a.m., looking as cocky as a young college student after a successful night with a girl. Willkie then confessed he'd invited Madame Chiang to return to Washington with him. It fell to Cowles to tell Madame Chiang this was neither possible nor advisable. When he broke the news to her, Madame Chiang scratched Cowles' cheeks so deeply the marks were said to have remained for a week. In fact, Madame Chiang didn't need Wendell's invitation to visit America. She once again threw herself into gathering support, money, and war aid for China. and launched a whirlwind tour of the United States. In just 8 months, she crossed the whole of America, from Los Angeles to New York.
Let us not forget that Japan, in her occupied areas today, has greater resources at her command than Germany.
And it was not by coincidence that she ran into Wendell Willkie several times en route.
New York, most sophisticated and celebrity-wise of cities, sets a new high in welcomes. For like the rest of America, New York realizes Madame Chiang is no ordinary celebrity. The wife of one of the world's greatest military and political leaders, she is also a leader herself.
While in New York, Madame Chiang invited Willkie's friend, Gardner Cowles, to dine in the Waldorf Astoria Towers. That night, Cowles claimed Madame Chiang instructed him to spend whatever was necessary to get Willkie the Republican nomination for the next presidential race. She promised China would foot the bill. Cowles recalls her saying,
"If Wendell could be elected, then he and I would rule the world. I would rule the Orient, and Wendell would rule the Western world."
It was an absurd proposal, but Cowles later claimed he was so mesmerized by her that he would not have dismissed anything she said.
Japan has moved one stage farther into China.
But by now, China was on the verge of defeat. Japan held all China's northern and eastern territories. Chemical and biological weapons had taken a deadly toll and made even more millions homeless. The immediate problem for Madame Chiang was securing the billions of dollars of war aid that China so desperately needed. Then, in 1943, she was handed a golden opportunity to make her case directly to the people who mattered, before it was too late.
Arriving at Washington, Madame Chiang is greeted by Mrs. Rosa.
Madame Chiang was invited to the White House.
She drives off with President and Mrs. Roosevelt.
She would stay there for a week as a special guest of the Roosevelts. She did nothing to temper her grand manner and arrived in style, with her own silk sheets and expecting the red carpet treatment, clapping her hands to summon the White House servants. As Eleanor Roosevelt later said, she can talk beautifully about democracy, but she does not know how to live democracy. For all the cordiality, Roosevelt remained unconvinced he should send large sums of aid to China. But that didn't deter Madame Chiang. She was about to address both houses of Congress and become the first foreign woman to do so. If she was to secure the billions of dollars of American loans that China needed, then she'd have to charm Congress and exert her influence like never before. On February 18th, 1943, in the Capitol building, she took her position at the podium.
It is my great pleasure, my high privilege, and my distinguished honor to present to you Madame Chiang Kai-Shek.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Congress of the United States.
What followed was a powerful and impassioned plea for assistance in fighting the Japanese.
Let us not forget that during the first 4.5 years of total aggression, China has borne Japan's sadistic fury unaided and alone. It now remains for you, the present representatives of the American people, to point the way to win the war, to help construct a world in which all peoples may henceforth live in harmony and peace.
Her words brought some to tears. Congress had never seen anything like it. Watching in the Senate gallery, Eleanor Roosevelt commented that Madam Chiang's speech marked the recognition of a woman who, through her personality and her own service, had achieved a place in the world. When she spoke, it was no longer as a woman that one thought of her. Madam Chiang had both houses of Congress in the palm of her hand. Congress and Senate were united. They must send as much aid to China as possible. Roosevelt was forced to reverse his policy. She had secured billions of dollars of surplus American military supplies and generous loans for the extra hardware her country so desperately required.
In order to accomplish this purpose, we must now so prosecute the war that victory will be ours decisively and with all good speed.
She was now the most powerful woman in the world. But at home, trouble was brewing once again. Rumours began to circulate that Chiang had taken a mistress. The affair caught everyone's attention. American journalists reported seething domestic troubles in the couple's home in Chongqing. They quoted Madam Chiang as being tired, ill, and hiding away from the public eye. Even the Chinese Communist Party joined in and predicted Madam would sue for divorce. London's Daily Mail exclaimed that Chiang and Madam had already split. It was a very public and humiliating payback for her affair with American Wendell Willkie, and the first of a series of personal hammer blows.
To the whole free world, the stunning news has come that Franklin Roosevelt is dead.
On April 12, 1945, President Roosevelt died. He was replaced by President Truman, who Madam Chiang did not know. Madam Chiang's old lover, Wendell Willkie, never made it to be president. He dropped out of the last presidential race and shortly after died of a heart attack. With fewer friends on the world stage, now more than ever, Madam Chiang couldn't afford to split from her husband and to be usurped as China's First Lady, especially as there was more trouble ahead for China. While the rest of the world was celebrating the end of war, China was facing a humanitarian disaster. Despite the end of hostilities, there had been few improvements in living standards. Chiang's military miscalculations and his administration's notorious corruption meant there had already been several attempts to remove him from government. Chiang's position was becoming increasingly untenable. His country was now ripe for revolution. The communists could not be held at bay any longer. Stalin had promised his Chinese comrade, Mao Zedong, thousands of rifles, machine guns and tanks, which had been taken from the defeated Japanese. Then, in June 1946, full-scale civil war broke out. Chiang's beleaguered army was now facing the same military hardware, but in the hands of a different enemy. The communists were finally a force to be reckoned with. Madam Chiang, once again keen to prove herself irreplaceable both to her nation and to her husband, stepped in. She arranged a visit to America to beg for more aid, this time to fight the communists. It was a desperate mission, a final attempt to save the nationalist movement to which she and her husband had dedicated their lives. Her departure would mark the last time she would set foot upon the Chinese mainland. But this time, America gave her a very different reception. President Truman made her wait 9 days before he granted her a brief audience. Despite the smiles and diplomatic overtures, this time there was no invitation to stay at the White House. Truman believed Chiang lacked popular support, and he was right. By the time Truman withdrew American aid, Chiang's troops were already surrendering to the communists. On January 21st, 1949, Chiang resigned. Within 6 days, his party was in peace negotiations with Mao. The communists emerged as victors. Nationalist rule was at an end. Chiang, his defeated army, and around 2 million nationalist Chinese fled the People's Republic of China across the narrow channel to the island of Taiwan. During this time, Madame Chiang had remained in the US, but in 1950, she prepared to return to her husband in Taiwan.
I wish to take this opportunity to thank the many friends who have sent me telegrams and have written me and telephoned me to express your sympathy and love for my country. I wish you all the luck in the world, and God bless you. Goodbye.
Their marriage may have been at times tempestuous, but it seemed they had now forgiven each other.
I hope we can be together every year from now on and never separate again.
Chiang had set up a nationalist government in exile. On her arrival in Taiwan, Madame Chiang once again became a central figure in her husband's administration. She resumed her role as international ambassador, determined not to give up on a united nationalist China.
With or without help, we shall fight. We are not defeated. Millions of my countrymen are yet dedicated to the long fight. As long as a breath remains in us, and with faith in the Almighty, we shall continue the struggle.
Chiang proclaimed his government to be the true government of all China. With two rival regimes claiming the same thing, Madame Chiang's power of persuasion would once again come to the fore.
The United Nations, symbol of man's hope.
Through an unrelenting diplomatic drive, Madame Chiang persuaded the United Nations to recognize her husband's tiny island state as the sole legitimate government of all China, representing over 660 million Chinese people.
The seating of Nationalist China's delegate on the Security Council.
Chiang's nationalists even represented China on the UN Security Council for over 20 years. It was one of her most remarkable achievements. Under Chiang, Taiwan was a one-party state governed under martial law, but it nonetheless began the steady development into one of the world's most prosperous countries with a strong and dynamic economy. Gradually, General and Madame Chiang became resigned both to having failed to unite China and to their life in exile.
What do you miss most by being exiled from your homeland?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm exiled from my homeland because Taiwan is a province of the Republic of China. But if you mean, what do I miss most on the mainland, I would say my compatriots. Of course, all the people here are also my compatriots, but there are so many of them, and the vastness...
600 million of them.
And the vastness of the spacious skies and the diversities of climate and locale. Really, what we have there is not a country, but a continent, and I miss that.
On April 5th, 1975, aged 87, General Chiang died. Madam Chiang's husband and political partner of nearly 50 years was gone.
The President's departure from this world was very hard for me to quite accept as reality.
Shortly after, Madam Chiang returned to America for good. Instead of pursuing politics as she had in the past, she turned her hand to something different. Madam Chiang took up painting.
An astounding thing has happened. You simply won't believe it. I have been learning Chinese painting these past 5 months, and all the artists and connoisseurs of Chinese painting say that I have the possibilities of a great artist.
At the great age of 103, Madam Chiang held an exhibition of her work in New York. She died 2 years later, aged 105. None of her works have ever been put up for sale. Madam Chiang was at the forefront of Chinese politics at a crucial time in her country's history. She and her husband may not have unified China as they wanted, but they did deliver their country from widespread poverty and deprivation and stalled the spread of communism.
The goal of our common struggle should be to shape the future.
Madam Chiang secured huge international support and placed the Republic of China at the very heart of world affairs. To their opponents, she and her husband were sometimes ruthless leaders of a corrupt regime, but to their followers, they embodied China's struggle for freedom. Whatever the view, one thing is acknowledged. In a remarkable life that spanned 3 centuries, Madam Chiang rose to become, for a time, the most powerful woman in the world, and a true politician to the very end.
For that which is morally wrong can never be politically right.